There's something interesting that happens when you start observing people's financial behavior instead of their lifestyle. You begin to notice that some decisions don't make sense at first glance, at least not from the perspective most people use. In fact, there are choices that seem unnecessary, overly cautious, or even counterintuitive, especially in a world where everyone is constantly trying to optimize how they are perceived. But what's most fascinating is that these same choices are often repeated by people who, over time, reach a level of financial stability that others struggle to understand. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because the difference between financial progress and financial illusion isn't always visible in the moment. Sometimes both paths look almost identical while they're happening. Only later do they start leading in completely different directions. So instead of thinking about why truly wealthy people don't spend the way you'd expect, a better question to ask would be, what if some behaviors that seem strange in the moment are actually the ones shaping long-term financial freedom? My name is Ben, and in today's video, we're going to explore the hidden logic behind financial decisions from people who often appear to have very little, but are actually building significant wealth through the very same choices that are misunderstood from the outside. Most of us grow up believing that wealth has a certain look. If someone has a lot of money, we expect to see it. A bigger house, a luxury car, designer clothes, the latest phone, the best vacations. That assumption feels completely reasonable. After all, if you can afford almost anything, why wouldn't you show it? That's why something very strange starts happening when you pay close attention to people who have actually built significant wealth. Many of them simply don't look wealthy. They wear simple clothes. They rarely feel the need to replace something just because a newer version came out. Sometimes they even hesitate before spending money on something they could easily afford 10 times over. From the outside, they seem completely ordinary. In some cases, they even seem unusually frugal. And that's exactly where the paradox begins. Because these people aren't saving money because they have to. They aren't avoiding spending because they can't afford it. In many cases, they could upgrade nearly every part of their lifestyle tomorrow if they wanted to, but they simply don't. Not because they're afraid, they just make different decisions. And that raises a question that's hard to ignore. If these people really have money, why do so many of them deliberately choose to look less financially successful than they actually are? What do they understand about money that most people have never stopped to consider? Because once you notice this pattern, it's almost impossible to unsee it. And if you want to understand how wealthy people really think about spending, not just about making money, make sure you're subscribed, because this is one of the topics we explore most on this channel. And the answer begins with one simple shift in perspective. The moment you see that shift, these habits stop looking like sacrifices and start looking like some of the smartest financial decisions a person can make. What's really happening is that from a very young age, we're taught to recognize wealth by looking at what people own. Without even realizing it, we learn to treat visible purchases as proof of financial success. And honestly, that isn't an irrational conclusion. After all, the easiest way to judge someone's financial situation is by looking at the things everyone else can see. Very few of us ever stop to consider that we might be looking at wealth from the wrong perspective. Because the truth is, every visible purchase tells you only one thing. It tells you that money was spent. It doesn't tell you how much money that person actually has. It doesn't tell you how much they invest. It doesn't tell you how much they owe. And it certainly doesn't tell you how much wealth they've actually built over time. That's exactly where one of the biggest financial misconceptions begins. We spend years treating consumption as evidence of wealth when, in reality, spending is only evidence that someone bought something. And those are two completely different things. Someone driving a luxury SUV might have an enormous net worth, or they might be making payments on a 7-year loan with almost no investments to their name. Someone wearing a plain t-shirt might look completely ordinary. Or they might own businesses, investments, and income-producing assets that quietly generate more money every month than many people earn in an entire year. From the outside, both stories can look completely different from reality. That's why people who build long-term wealth seem to be playing an entirely different game. Instead of worrying about making their wealth visible, they're focused on making it grow. Instead of asking, "How successful do I look?" they're usually asking, "How much freedom will this decision create for my future?" It's a subtle shift, but it changes almost every financial decision that comes afterward. Once you stop confusing visible consumption with real wealth, many behaviors that once seemed cheap, boring, or even unnecessary suddenly begin to make perfect sense. And that's exactly where this conversation becomes even more interesting. Because the habits you're about to see aren't signs that someone has less money. More often than not, they're precisely the behaviors that allow certain people to build far more wealth than anyone realizes. But before anything else, there's one important thing you need to understand. None of the choices you're about to see were made to make someone look modest. In fact, from the outside, many of them look like the exact opposite of what we expect from someone who's financially successful. And maybe that's exactly why they're so often misunderstood. The first one shows up in a place where almost everyone expects to see a sign of wealth: the car. It's common to assume that the more money someone has, the more often they replace their car. But people who build long-term wealth usually see that decision very differently. To them, a car is, above all, a tool. If it's reliable, safe, and does everything they need it to do, the fact that a newer or more powerful model exists is rarely enough reason to replace it. Not because they can't afford another one, but because novelty alone almost never justifies the cost. From the outside, that can look like a lack of ambition. In their minds, it's simply a rational decision. Something very similar happens with the homes they choose to live in. There's a widely accepted belief that the size of your home should grow every time your income grows, as if every promotion or increase in net worth should automatically come with a bigger address. But many financially intelligent people resist that impulse. They'd rather live in a home that's comfortable, functional, and well-suited to the life they actually live, even knowing they could easily afford something much larger. Because they understand that a house is never just about the purchase price, it comes with higher property taxes, more maintenance, more furniture, higher utility bills, more time, more responsibility. In other words, every extra square foot keeps charging you long after the paperwork has been signed. Once you start noticing those choices, another pattern begins to appear. Now it moves beyond material possessions and starts showing up in social situations. While many people feel the need to keep up with the people around them, those who build wealth are usually much more comfortable saying no. They don't join every trip just because everyone else is going. They don't automatically say yes to every expensive dinner. And it's not because they don't enjoy those experiences. It's because they refuse to let other people's financial priorities dictate their own. There's a huge difference between choosing to spend money and feeling like you have to spend it just to avoid feeling left out. People who build wealth protect that difference very carefully. Another behavior that surprises a lot of people is how quiet they are. When someone reaches a significant financial milestone, we tend to assume they'll want the whole world to know. But very often, the opposite happens. These people usually talk about money far less than most of us would expect. They don't constantly bring up their investments, they don't feel the need to mention how much they make, and they don't seem interested in proving that they're financially successful. Because once your financial security no longer depends on other people's approval, the need to display it starts to disappear too. And maybe this is where their entire mindset becomes the clearest. The real reward stops being looking wealthy. It becomes watching your wealth grow. There's a much deeper sense of satisfaction in seeing your investments increase in value, watching your assets generate income, or realizing that your financial freedom keeps expanding. That kind of progress doesn't earn applause. It doesn't attract attention. Most people never even notice it. But for someone who thinks this way, it's far more rewarding than buying something designed to impress everyone else. And naturally, that changes the final question they ask before spending money. Most people ask, "Can I afford this today?" People who build wealth usually ask something very different. How much is this decision going to keep costing me in the years ahead? Because buying something is almost never the full cost. A car continues to require insurance, maintenance, and loses value over time. A bigger house continues to demand higher taxes, more furniture, and larger monthly expenses. Even small luxuries can quietly create a lifestyle that becomes expensive to maintain. The real calculation stops being the purchase price. It becomes the cost of keeping that decision alive for years to come. When you look at each of these behaviors on its own, they can seem like nothing more than small personal preferences. But when all of them appear together, they reveal an entirely different philosophy about money. None of these choices were made to look humble. Every one of them exists to protect something far more valuable: the ability to keep building wealth year after year without allowing your lifestyle to slowly consume the very wealth you worked so hard to create. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that most people look at these choices and consistently reach the wrong conclusion. Because if these behaviors make so much financial sense, why are they still seen as signs of failure by so many people? That's a fascinating question, because driving an older car, living in a smaller home than you could comfortably afford, saying no to certain social expenses, not feeling the need to talk about money, most people instinctively put all of those behaviors into the same category. They assume they all point to one thing: a lack of money. But that's exactly where the biggest misunderstanding begins. Because the appearance of wealth is a reflection of consumption. Real wealth is a reflection of habits. And I have to be honest, this difference may seem small to a lot of people, but it changes almost everything. Think about it for a moment. Anyone can create the appearance of wealth if they're willing to spend enough money. A luxury car can be financed. Designer clothes can be bought on credit. From the outside, all of those things can look exactly like financial success. But appearances only show what someone decided to buy. They don't reveal what that decision actually cost them financially. And that's where so many people, without realizing it, start heading in the wrong direction. Instead of asking, "Will this decision make me wealthier?" people start asking, "How will this decision make me look?" And that's when image begins shaping behavior. The desire to appear successful starts making financial decisions before logic ever gets the chance. Over time, that creates an interesting cycle. The harder someone tries to look wealthy, the harder it often becomes to actually build wealth, because maintaining an image usually requires constant spending. Building wealth usually requires constant discipline, and those two paths often move in opposite directions. Maybe that's exactly why some of the wealthiest people rarely look the way we expect them to. Not because they are trying to hide their success, but because they were never trying to communicate success in the first place. Their priority was never creating the appearance of wealth. It was creating the reality of it. While everyone else was focused on what could be seen, they were busy building something that never needed to be seen to exist. And maybe that's the biggest shift in perspective this entire conversation is asking you to make. Stop measuring financial success by what people choose to display, and start paying attention to the habits that quietly make that success possible. Because there's one thing that almost nobody realizes. These choices don't just save money, they buy something that millions of people spend their entire lives trying to achieve without ever realizing it. And you're about to find out exactly what that is. Now that you have a better understanding of these habits and behaviors, you might be wondering, what do these people actually get in return for making these choices? Because if living this way simply meant giving up comfort, very few people would choose it, but that's not what's really happening. The biggest reward usually isn't a higher net worth, or a larger investment portfolio, or even having more money sitting in the bank. The first benefit is far less visible than that. It's peace of mind. It's having room to make mistakes. It's feeling less pressure to maintain a lifestyle that constantly demands more. And above all, it's having the freedom to make decisions because you want to, not because your financial situation leaves you with no other choice. That kind of freedom doesn't sit in your driveway, it doesn't hang in your closet, and it certainly doesn't get attention on social media, but it quietly changes what everyday life feels like. That's why this way of thinking has never really been about spending less. It's always been about needing less in order to feel financially secure. And maybe that's the biggest point of this entire conversation. While many people use money to buy a temporary feeling of success, people who build lasting wealth use money to buy something that still exists long after the purchase has been forgotten. More time, more peace of mind, more independence, more choices. Things that rarely impress other people, but completely transform the lives of the people who have them. And once you understand that, it becomes much easier to realize that maybe these people were never trying to look poor. They were making a completely different choice. And that choice is exactly what answers the question that opened this video. At the beginning of this video, it seemed like a paradox. If someone could afford to live like a millionaire, why would they choose to look like they had far less money than they actually do? By now, you've probably realized that the question itself was based on a false assumption. Because these people never wake up thinking, today I want to look poor. The truth is, they simply stopped using consumption as a way to communicate success. And that difference is much bigger than it seems. They don't drive a simpler car because they want other people to think they have less money. And they certainly don't pass on certain expenses because they're afraid to enjoy life. Those decisions are rarely about the image they project. They're about the life they want to build for themselves. Once you stop feeling the need to prove you've made it, your financial decisions begin to change naturally. You buy something because it genuinely improves your life, not because it improves the way other people see you. So what looks like a lack of money to some people is often nothing more than freedom from the need to impress others. When you no longer need every purchase to validate your success, money stops being a tool for building an image and starts becoming a tool for building a life. Maybe that's why so many people spend years chasing the appearance of wealth, while others spend those same years building something that's much harder to see, but far more valuable to have. And once you understand all of this, maybe the most important question is no longer why some people choose to live this way. The real question becomes, what kind of life are your own financial choices building, even when no one is watching? Because when you really think about it, the biggest difference between these two ways of handling money is that they offer completely different kinds of rewards. Every financial decision rewards you in some way. The only difference is that some rewards come almost immediately, while others take years to appear. When someone buys something to signal success, the response is usually almost instant. People notice, they comment, they compliment it. There's a real sense of recognition. For a brief moment, it feels like that purchase accomplished exactly what it was supposed to. The problem is that this kind of reward fades just as quickly as it arrives. Before long, the purchase stops attracting attention. A new trend appears. A new comparison takes its place. And the pressure to keep maintaining that image comes right back. Meanwhile, decisions made with long-term wealth in mind tend to produce the exact opposite effect. At first, almost no one notices. Sometimes those choices even seem overly cautious, but those same decisions keep producing results long after everyone has forgotten what that person chose not to buy. That's why time completely changes the way these habits are perceived. What may look like being overly cautious today can become a life with far less financial stress years from now, because time does something appearances never can. It reveals the accumulated consequences of small choices repeated over many years. And in the end, this isn't a choice reserved only for millionaires. All of us make this choice almost every single day. Every time we decide between spending money for immediate recognition or preserving resources to create more opportunities for the future. While some decisions attract attention the moment they're made, others go completely unnoticed, and a few years later, what remains visible isn't the decisions themselves. It's the life those decisions ultimately built. In the end, maybe the biggest cost of trying to look successful isn't even the money you spend. Maybe it's the fact that, little by little, other people start influencing decisions that should belong only to you. Because when a purchase exists to meet the expectations of whoever is watching, it stops being a financial decision and becomes a social one. On the other hand, there is a huge sense of freedom when you no longer need that approval. And in that moment, something good happens. You start spending because it actually makes sense for your life. Nothing more than that. So the next time you admire someone else's lifestyle, remember one thing. You are only seeing the visible part of the story. The decisions that truly transform a financial life almost always happen away from everyone's eyes. And that's what will make the difference a few years from now. If this video changed the way you see wealth, let me know in the comments. Which of these habits and behaviors changed your perspective the most? And if you like content that shows how small financial decisions can transform your future, subscribe to the channel. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, there are new videos to help you build a smarter financial life without relying on appearance, trends, or miracle formulas. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.